Darkcast Network. Out of the shadows comes the best of indie podcasts. On Christmas Eve, 1945, a strange phone call began what was a series of events that led to a fire destroying the Sodder residence, where the parents and 9 of 10 children slept. All but 5 of the children escaped, but the other bodies were never found. The Sodder family still, after almost 80 years, believe the missing children are still alive. Years later, a piece of evidence proving the survival turns up, bringing up a whole new set of questions. Who called that night? And what led to a mystery that no one has been able to solve? My name is DJ, and this is the Mythical True Crime Podcast. George Sodder was born with the name Giorgio Sadu in Tula, Sardinia, Italy, in 1895. He immigrated to the United States 13 years later with an older brother who went back home as soon as both boys had cleared customs at Ellis Island. For the rest of his life, George, as he became known, would not talk much about why he left his homeland. Sodder eventually found work on the railroads in Pennsylvania, carrying water and other supplies to workers. After a few years, he took a more permanent work as a driver in Smithers, West Virginia. There, he started his own trucking company, initially hauling fill dirt to construction sites, and later hauling coal mined in the region. Jenny Cipriani, a storekeeper's daughter in Smithers, who also emigrated from Italy in her childhood, became George's wife. The Sodders settled outside of Fayetteville, where they had a large population of Italian immigrants, in a 2-story timber frame home 2 miles north of town. In 1923, they had the first of their 10 children. George's business prospered, and they became, quote, one of the most respected middle-class families around, in the words of the local officials. However, George had strong opinions about many subjects and was not shy about expressing them, sometimes alienating people. In particular, his strident opposition to Italian dictator Benito Mussolini had led to some strong arguments with other members of the immigrant community. The last of the Sodder children, Sylvia, was born in 1942. By then, their second oldest son, Joe, who was 21, had left home to serve the military during World War II. The following year, Mussolini was deposed and executed. However, George's criticism of the late dictator had left some hard feelings. In October 1945, a visiting life insurance salesman, after being rebuffed, warned George that his house, quote, would go up in smoke and your children are going to be destroyed, attributing thus to all the dirty remarks that you've been making about Mussolini. Another visitor to the house, seeking work, took the occasion to go around to the back and warn George that a pair of fuse boxes would cause a fire someday. George was puzzled by the observation since he had just had the house rewired with an electric stove when it was installed, and the local electric company said afterwards that it was safe. In the weeks before Christmas that year, George's older sons had also noticed a strange car parking along the main highway through town, and its occupants watching the younger Sodder children as they returned from school. The Sodder family celebrated on Christmas Eve 1945. Marion, who was 19, the oldest daughter, had been working at the dime store in downtown Fayetteville. She surprised 3 of the younger sisters, Martha, 12, Jenny, 8, and Betty, 5, with new toys that she had bought for them as gifts. The younger children were so excited that they asked their mother if they could stay up past what would have been their usual bedtime. At 10 p.m., Jenny told them that they could stay up a little longer, just as long as the two oldest boys, who were still awake, 14-year-old Maurice and 9-year-old brother Louis, remembered to pull the cows in and feed the chickens before going to bed themselves. George and the two oldest boys, John, who was 22, and George Jr., 16, had spent the whole day working with their father, and they were already asleep. After reminding the children of those remaining chores, she took Sylvia, who was 2, upstairs with her, and they went to bed together. The telephone rang at 12:30 a.m. Jenny woke and went downstairs to answer it. The caller was a woman whose voice she didn't recognize, asking for a name she was not familiar with. And when she said she didn't know who that person was, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses began in the background. Jenny repeated to the caller that she must have reached the wrong number, and later recalled the woman's weird laugh. She hung up on the person and returned to bed. As she did, she noticed the lights were still on downstairs, and the curtains were not drawn, 2 of the things that her children normally attend to when they stay up later within their parents. Marion had already fallen asleep on the living room couch, so Jenny assumed the other children, who stayed up later, and must have gone back up to the attic where they slept. She closed the curtains, turned out the lights, and went to bed. At 1 a.m., Jenny was again awakened, this time by the sound of an object hitting the house's roof with a loud bang, and then a rolling noise. After hearing nothing further, she went back to sleep. After another half hour or so, she woke up again, this time smelling smoke. When she got up, she found that the room George used as his office was on fire, around the telephone line and the fuse box. Jenny woke him, and in turn woke his older sons. Both parents and 4 of their children, Marion, Sylvia, John, and George Jr., escaped the house. They frantically yelled to the children upstairs and heard no response. They couldn't go up there as the stairway itself had already been reflamed. John said that his first police interview after the fire, that he went up to the attic to alert his siblings sleeping there, though he later changed his story to say that he only called up there and didn't actually see them. Efforts to find aid and rescue to the children were unexpectedly complicated. The phone didn't work, so Marion ran to the neighbor's house to call the Fayetteville Police Department and Fire Department. The driver on a nearby road had also seen the flames and called from a nearby tavern, but they too were unsuccessful, either because they just couldn't reach the operator or because the phone line there had turned out to be broken. Either the neighbor or the passing motorists were eventually successful in reaching the fire department from another phone in the center of town. George, barefoot at the time, climbed the house's outside wall and broke open the attic window, cutting his arm in the process. He and his sons intended to use a ladder to the attic to rescue the other children, but it wasn't in its usual spot, resting against the house, and would not be found anywhere else nearby. A water barrel that would have been used to extinguish the flame was frozen solid. George then tried to pull both of the trucks he used in his business up to the house and use them to climb up the attic window, but neither of them would start, despite having worked perfectly prior to the previous day. Frustrated, the 6 Sodders who had escaped had no choice but to watch the house burn down and collapse over the next 45 minutes. They assumed the other 5 children had perished in the blaze. The fire department, low on manpower due to the war and relying on individual firefighters to call each other, didn't respond until later that next morning. Chief F.J. Morris said the next day that they had already had a slow response, but it was further hampered by his inability to drive the fire truck, requiring he wait until someone who could drive it was available. Firefighters, one of whom was the brother of Jenny, could do little but to look through the ashes to see what was left in the Sodder's basement. By 10 a.m., Morris told the Sodders that they had not found any bones, as they might have been expected if the other children had been in the house as it burned. According to another account, they did find a few bone fragments and internal organs, but chose not to tell the family. It is also noted by modern fire professionals that the search was cursory at best. Nevertheless, Morris believed that the 5 children unaccounted for had died in the fire, and suggested that it must have been hot enough to burn the bodies completely. Morris then told George to leave the site undisturbed so as the state's fire marshal's office could conduct a more thorough investigation. However, after 4 days, George and his wife could not bear sight anymore, so they bulldozed 5 feet of dirt over the site with the intention of converting it to a memorial garden for their lost children. The local coroner convened at an inquest the next day, which held the fire that was caused by an accident by faulty wiring. Among the jurors was the man who had threatened George at this house when it burned down and that his children destroyed in retribution for his anti-Mussolini remarks. Death certificates for all 5 children were issued December 30th of that year. The local newspaper contradicted itself, stating that all the bodies had been found, but then later in the same story reported that only part of one body was recovered. George and Jenny were too grief-stricken to attend the funeral on January 2nd, 1946, although their surviving children did. Not long afterward, as they began to rebuild their lives, the Sodder family started to question all the official findings about the fire. They wondered why, if it hadn't been caused by an electrical problem, that the family's electrical Christmas lights remained on throughout the fire's early stages, even when the power should have been gone out. When they did find the ladder that was missing from the side of the house that night, it was at the bottom of an embankment 75 feet away. A telephone repairman told the Sodders that the house's phone line was not burned throughout the fire. As they initially thought, it was actually cut by someone who had been willing to climb the 14-foot pole outside their property and reach 2 feet outward away from the pole to cut the line. A man who neighbors had been stealing a block and tackle from the property around that time also was identified and arrested. He admitted to the theft and claimed that he had been the one who cut the phone line, thinking that it was a power line, but denied having anything else to do, especially with the fire. There's no record identifying the suspect or any suspect that exists, and why would he have wanted to cut the phone or the utility lines to the Sodder's residence anyway while he was stealing block and tackle? It was never explained. Jenny said in 1968 that if he had cut the power line, she and her husband, along with their other 4 children, would have never been able to make it out of the house. Jenny also said she had trouble accepting Morris's belief that all traces of the children's bodies had been burned completely. Many of the household appliances had been found, still recognizable in the ash, along with fragments of the tin roof. She contrasted the results of the fire with a newspaper account of a similar house that she had read at the same time that killed a family of 7, and all skeletal remains of all the victims were reported to have been found in that case. Jenny burned small piles of animal bones to see if they were completely consumed. None ever were. An employee of the local crematorium told her after she contacted him that human bones remain even after bodies are burned at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for over 2 hours, far longer and hotter than the house fire could have ever been. The Sodder's truck's failure to start was also being considered. George believed that they had been tampered with, perhaps by the same man who stole the block and tackle and cut the phone line. However, one of George's son-in-laws told the Charleston Gazette-Mail in 2013 that he had come to believe that the Sodder and his sons might have, in their haste to start the trucks, flooded the engines. Some accounts have suggested the wrong number phone call that the Sodder house might have had somehow been connected to the fire. However, Investigators later located the woman who had made the call. She had confirmed it had been a wrong number on her part. After this quick message, we'll be right back.
Hello there, listeners. Whether you're new or you've been with me from the start, a great way to catch up and dive deeper into the world of mythical true crime is to check out my earlier shows. I've covered everything from Bigfoot to aliens and ghosts. Take a moment and browse through the past episodes, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Your support means everything to me.
Now, as spring approached, the Sodders, as they said they would, planted flowers in the soil bulldozed over their home. Jenny tended it carefully for the rest of her life. However, further developments in early 1946 reinforced the family's belief that the children were memorialized might, in fact, be alive somewhere else. Evidence soon emerged indicating that the fire had not been started in the electrical fault, but instead was set deliberately. The driver of a bus that passed through Fayetteville late Christmas Eve said he had seen some people throwing, quote, balls of fire at the house. A few months later, when the snow had melted, Sylvia found a small, hard, dark green, rubber ball-like object in a bush nearby. George, recalling his wife's account of a large thump on the roof before the fire started, said it looked like a pineapple bomb or a hand grenade of some kind of incendiary device used in combat. The family later claimed that, contrary to the fire marshal's conclusion, the fire had started on the roof, although by then there was no way to prove it. Other witnesses claimed that they have seen missing Sodder children themselves. One woman, who had been watching the fire from the road, said she had seen some of them peering out from a passing car while the house was burning. Another woman at a restaurant between Fayetteville and Charleston said that she had served them breakfast the next morning, noted that the presence of the car with a Florida license plate in the rest stop's parking lot as well. The Sodders had enough, and they hired a private investigator named C.C. Tinsley from the nearby town to look into the case. Tinsley informed the family that the insurance salesman who had threatened George over the anti-Mussolini sentiments had been on the coroner's jury that ruled the fire an accident. He also learned the rumors around Fayetteville that despite the report to the Sodders that no remains had been found in the ashes, Morris had found a heart that he later packed into a metal box and secretly buried. Morris had apparently confessed this to a local minister who in turn confirmed it to George. George and Tinsley went to Morris and confronted him with this news. Now, Morris agreed to show the two where he had buried the metal box, and they dug it up. When they took what they found inside to the local funeral director, he examined him and told him that, in reality, it was beef liver that had never been exposed to fire. Later, more rumors circulated around Fayetteville. Morris had afterwards admitted that the box with the liver had indeed not come from the fire originally. He had supposedly placed it there in the hope that the Sodders would find it and be satisfied that the missing children were indeed dead and had died in the fire. Now, in 1949, on one occasion, George saw a magazine photo of a group of young ballet dancers in New York City. One of them looked strikingly like his missing daughter, Betty. This drove him so much, in fact, that he traveled all the way to that girl's school, where he repeated demands to see this girl himself, but was refused. George also tried to interest the Federal Bureau of Investigation in investigating what he considered a kidnapping. FBI director at the time was J. Edgar Hoover, who personally responded to his letters. Quote, "Although I had liked to be of service, the matter related appears to be of local character and does not come within the investigative jurisdiction of this Bureau." If the local authorities requested the Bureau's assistance, he added, he would of course directed agents to assist, but the Fayetteville police and fire departments declined to do so. In August 1949, George was able to persuade Oscar Hunter, a Washington, D.C. pathologist, to supervise a new search through the dirt of the house site. After a very thorough search, artifacts including a dictionary that had belonged to the children and some coins were found. Several small bone fragments were also unearthed, and they were determined to be of a human vertebrae. The bone fragments were then sent to Marshall T. Newman, specialist at the Smithsonian Institute. They confirmed with the lumbar vertebrae, all from the same person. Quote, "Since the transverse recesses are fused, the age of this individual at the time of death should have been around 16 or 17 years of age." Newman's report continued. The top limit of the age should be about 22, since the centra, which normally fuses at 23, are still unfused. This gives the age range, but it's not very likely that these bones were from any of the 5 missing children, since the oldest, Maurice, had only been 14 at the time. Although the report allowed that vertebrae of a boy his age, sometimes advanced enough that it would appear to be in the lower end of the range. Newman added that the bones showed no sign of exposure to flame. Further, he agreed that it was very strange that the bones were the only ones found. No rib bones, arms, legs, hands, or even a skull. Since the wood fire would have been a short duration, should have left full skeletons of all the children behind. The report concluded that the vertebrae had, instead, most likely come from the dirt that George used to bulldoze the site. Later, Tinsley supposedly confirmed that the bone fragments had come from a cemetery of the nearby Mount Hope. Couldn't explain why they had been taken there, or how they came to be at the fire site. The Smithsonian returned the bone fragments to George in September 1949. According to its records, their current location is unknown. The investigation and its findings attracted national attention, and the West Virginia legislature held 2 hearings on the case in 1950. Afterwards, however, Governor O.K. L. Patson and State Police Superintendent W.E. Burchett told the Sodders the case was, quote, hopeless, and closed it at the state level. The FBI decided it had jurisdiction at this point, as it was possible interstate kidnapping, and had dropped the case later after 2 years of following fruitless leads. With the end of the official efforts to resolve the case, the Sodder family still didn't give up any hope. They had flyers printed up with pictures of all 5 children, offering a $5,000 reward for information that would lead to settle the case for even one of them. In 1952, they had put up a billboard at the side of the house and another alongside U.S. Route 60 at the same information. It would, in time, become a landmark for traffic throughout Fayetteville on Route 19. The family's efforts soon brought in another reported sighting of the children after the fire. Ida Crutchfeld, a woman who ran a Charleston hotel, claimed to have seen the children approximately a week afterwards. "I don't remember the exact date," she said in a statement. "The children had come in around midnight with 2 men and 2 women, all of whom appeared to her to be of Italian extraction. When she attempted to speak to the children, one of the men looked at me in a hostile manner. He turned around and began talking rapidly in Italian. Immediately, the whole party stopped talking to me." She recalled that they had left the hotel early the next morning. Investigators today still do not, however, consider the story credible. She had only first seen photos of the children 2 years after the fire, 5 years before she even came forward. George followed up leads in person, traveling to the areas where the tips had come from. A woman from St. Louis, Missouri, claimed that Martha was being held in a convent there. A bar patron in Texas claimed to have overheard 2 people making incriminating statements about a fire that happened on Christmas Eve in West Virginia some years before. None of those proved significant, and when George heard later that a relative of Jenny's in Florida had children that looked similar to his, the relative had to prove that the children were his own before George would even be satisfied. In 1967, George went to the Houston area to investigate another tip. A woman there had written to the family, saying that Lewis had revealed his true identity to her one night after having too much to drink. She believed that he and Maurice were both living in Texas somewhere. However, when George and his son-in-law, Grover Paxton, were unable to speak with her, police were then able to help them find the two men she was indicating, but they denied that they were their missing sons. Paxton said years later that doubts about that denial lingered in George's mind the rest of his life. But then something came that was very unexpected. A letter was received that year, brought to the Sodders, from what they believed the most credible evidence that they could have, at least to know that Lewis was still alive. One day, Jenny found in the mail a letter addressed to her and her alone, postmarked in Central City, Kentucky, with no return address. Inside was a picture of a young man of around 30 years of age, with features strongly resembling Lewis's, who would have been around in his 30s if he had survived. On the back of the photo, it was written, "Lewis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, Lil Boys." Capital letter A, 90132, or 35. The family hired another private investigator to go to Central City to look into this missive, but he never reported back to the Sodders, and they were unable to locate him afterwards, suspecting him of just stealing their money. The picture nonetheless gave them hope. They added it to the billboard, leaving Central City out and all other published information out of fear that Lewis might come to harm, and put an enlargement of the photo over their fireplace. George admitted to the Charleston Gazette-Mail late in the next year that the lack of information had been hitting like a rock wall. "We can't go any further." He nevertheless vowed to continue. "Time is running out for us," he admitted in another interview around that time. "But we only want to know. If they did die in the fire, we want to be convinced. Otherwise, we want to know what happened to them." Unfortunately, George never got that answer, as he had died in the year 1969. Jenny and her surviving children, except John, who never talked about the fire that night, except to say that the family should just accept what happened and move on with their lives, continued to seek answers to the questions about the missing children's fate. After George's death, Jenny stayed in the family home, putting up fencing around it and adding additional rooms. For the rest of her life, she wore a black in mourning and tended to a garden at the site of the former house. She died in 1989, and her family finally took a weathered, worn billboard down. The surviving Sodder children, joined by their own children, continued to publicize the case and investigate leads. They too, along with the older Fayetteville residents, have theorized that the Sicilian Mafia was trying to extort money from George, and the children may have been taken by someone who knew about the planned arson and said that they would be safe if they had left the house. They were possibly taken back to Italy, and if the children had survived all those years, they were aware that their parents and siblings had survived too. The family believes that they may have been avoided contact in order to keep them from harm. Sylvia Sodder Paxton, the youngest of the surviving children, died in 2021. She was in the house on the night of the fire, which she said in her earliest memory, "I was the last one of the kids to leave home," she recalled to the Gazette-Mail in 2013. She and her father had often stayed up late, talking about what might have happened. "I experienced their grief for a long time." She believed that her siblings have survived that night, and assisted in the efforts to find them and publicize the case. Her daughter said in 2006, "She promised my grandparents she wouldn't let the story die, that she would do everything that she could." In the 20th century, the family's efforts have come to include online forums, like websleuths.com, in addition to media coverage. The increase in the latter has led to some who have examined the case to believe that the children did, in fact, die that year in 1945. George Bragg, a local author who wrote about this case in his 2012 book, West Virginia's Unsolved Murders, believes that John was telling the truth in his original account, saying that he tried to physically awaken his siblings before fleeing the house. He allows that the conclusion may still not be correct, saying, quote, "Logic tells you that they probably did burn up in the fire, but you can't always go by logic." Stacey Horn, who did a segment of this case at the National Public Radio around the 60th anniversary of the case in 2005, also believes that the children's death in the fire is also the most plausible solution. In a post on her blog, with material that she had cut from her story at the time, she noted that the fire had continued to smolder all night after the fire collapsed, and the 2 hours that was just not enough time to search through the ash thoroughly. Even if it had been, the firefighters at that time have not known to what to look for. However, she said, there's still also enough genuine weirdness in this whole story that if someday it is learned that the children didn't die in the fire, I wouldn't be shocked. In 2022, the History Channel even aired an episode of this series, History's Greatest Mysteries, that detailed the events of the case. This case still remains unsolved. Information about Jenny Irene Sodder and her siblings are located on thecharlieproject.org. I'm a huge fan of the Charlie Project, and I recommend you take a visit to the site. The link is in the description box below, and if you have any information relating to any of the Sodder children that were missing, contact the Fayetteville Police Department at 304-574-0255. Thank you very much for listening tonight and being part of the mythical true crime community, hosted by me, DJ. Subscribe to Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to get your weekly updates. And if you like what you hear, consider subscribing. Subscribing will directly support the show and the work that I'm doing. If you'd like to be a new supporter, consider clicking the link in the description box below. For less than a cup of coffee a month, you can help me continue to make great content for listeners everywhere. No commitment, cancel anytime. This has been the Mythical True Crime Podcast. My name is DJ. Good night.
And that concludes another captivating episode, delving into the world of mythical true crime. I appreciate you joining me tonight as we listen to the facts from these true crime tales. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we'll uncover even more mysteries. Until then, thank you for listening to tonight's episode. Good night.